Hi, everybody. Thanks a lot for coming. I just got back. I spent, I think it was this last weekend, at my own 25th business school reunion in New Haven, and hope you're enjoying it as much as we did, as much as we enjoyed ours. I always find it very interesting. I don't know how long this lasts, but at the 25th reunion, it's still true that half the people look like it was last week and nothing has happened to them in the middle, and the other half you say, really? Is it? And then you say, oh, no, you haven't changed a bit when you recover. So I want to talk to you about a little bit about the economics underlying this book I wrote about, which is called Everything I Ever Needed to Know About Economics I Learned from Online Dating. And basically, that's kind of a cheap title to get people's attention because the book has a little bit about online dating, but a lot about other contexts. And I'll talk some about online dating, but everything I say here can be put in the job market context just as well. Because I have to be honest, I didn't actually learn everything I do know about economics from online dating. I knew most of it from graduate school and from being a labor economist. So I'm a labor economist, and the labor market is very similar to the market for significant others or romantic partners. And I know you have to be an economist to use that last phrase, but this is kind of the way we think about it. And what I like about thinking about the economics using dating or the marriage market, what I really like about it is two things. One is people are interested in this market, of course, so that's nice. The other thing is when people think about economics, they think about money. Economists don't care at all about money. Well, I take that back. There are some macroeconomists who have to worry about money supply and things like that. But most economists, and certainly pretty much all microeconomists, money is just a convenience for transacting. We're not inherently interested in money at all. Remember, economics is the study of scarce resources. And in online dating, that's an appropriate place to think about that because there are a lot of scarce resources that we'll go through as we talk about this. So that's kind of what got me interested in doing this, and then any chance I get to teach people some economics in a way that doesn't feel that much like I'm doing that, and with limited mathematics is always fun for me. So let's talk about that. So what I'm going to do is take you through this in 4 steps. I'm not sure we'll get through all 4 steps. But basically, you can think about there being 4 stages in a relationship. And again, the job market context works very well here. So I can just change some of the terminology here, and I can say the economics of jobs in 4 stages. So there's choosing your market. That's true whether you're talking about jobs or dating. There's creating your profile, which in the job context would be putting together a resume and your LinkedIn profile and the like. But in the dating world, it's putting up your online profile. There's the first date or the job interview, you could think of it as. And then there's settling down. There's picking the job or picking your mate. And that's where I want to go. So these all relate to 1 or 2 different chapters of my book. Between this, you can sort of cover 6 of the 10 chapters. And I think from an economist perspective, the thing I like about breaking it down into these 4 segments is each of these 4 ideas won somebody a Nobel Prize in economics somewhere along the way. And so we'll talk about those examples and the contributions thereof as we go. So stage 1 is thinking about what market you want to get into. And basically, when you look at markets, bigger is better. That's a general rule. Now, there can be problems with finding the right match once you're in the big market. But if you'll indulge me, I'll just give you a sense for how that plays out. I'm just going to read a couple of paragraphs from the book that explain how that plays out in online dating. This is chapter 6 of the book. I said, as an experiment, I logged into Match.com and got a list of the women between 40 and 50 who live within 10 miles of me. I was presented with 454 women. I did the same thing on Date.com, and I was given 134 women to choose from. Does it matter which site I use? It seems like both have plenty of options for me. Now consider a third option. I play a lot of tennis. It would be nice to meet a woman who shared this interest. So I logged into tennisdate.com and searched for all women between 40 and 50 years old who live in California. I was presented with 52 options, 9 of whom were within a 1-hour drive of my house. That's a much smaller set to choose from, but at least they all share an interest of mine. I also pretended to be a vegetarian. I am not, but I'm willing to imagine for a few minutes, although I would draw the line of pretending to be vegan. There were 22 women between 40 and 50 living within 20 miles of me on veggiedate.com. You might think I'm making this stuff up, but I'm not. Any term you want, put it into the URL at the top of your screen and then put date.com at the end of it, and you will find a dating site. So finally, what if I try to meet women in person instead of over the internet? Living in an area with a lot of well-educated people, I'm lucky to live near a couple of high-quality bookstores. Each of these hosts a book club where patrons can meet to discuss a work of fiction. Now, I'll admit that I've never been to one of these clubs, so I can't make any statements about their demographic composition with absolute certainty, but I would bet that the vast majority of people who attend the meetings are female. I'd bet, too, that if I went to one of these meetings, I'd be the only man there and would meet about 5 women who are my age and single. So what we want to talk about now is which option is best, Match.com, Date.com, TennisDate.com, or the book club. And the basic principle is Match.com, or, I don't want to do advertisements for them, the largest site you can get. Because all else equal, bigger markets are better. Now, that's a general principle in economics. It's not limited to online dating or the job market. So, for example, financial markets, we want big markets. Why? Because we want more information acquisition. We want the allocation of resources to be most efficient. We want everybody to come together and allocate the resources efficiently and get the information fed through the market. Also, more price competition. So, a big bazaar with lots of people selling jewelry is going to be more efficient than individual jewelry stores where people can sort of take advantage of you. So, more efficient aggregation of information, more price competition. The same exact principle applies to dating sites and to the job market, but there's a huge difference. There's a very different reason for why that is. And that's because, as economists, I think about the market for matching to romantic partners as one of differentiated goods. So potential mates for me are differentiated goods, okay? And if you say that out loud, the market for you goes away very quickly, but nonetheless, that's the way to think about it. And so no 2 jobs and no 2 life partners are the same. You're talking about a group of, every barrel of oil is pretty much the same. Every box of cereal is, there are many that are the same, and then there are subtle differences across brands and so forth. So what we want is a thick market in life partners and in the job market. Why? Not because of that price competition effect, but because we want to find people, we want to be able to put together the best possible matches. So it's not that I just want a life partner. I want one who's good for me and for whom I am good in return. So how do we go about thinking about that? Why are big markets better for that sort of thing? Well, let me introduce a metaphor here to make the point. So think about this stage here as being a boardwalk. And I'm in the middle, and just think of people being spread out along the boardwalk, and the people who are closest to me on that boardwalk are very good matches for me. And the people at one end of the boardwalk are, think of Goldilocks. They're one end of the boardwalk, they're too big. At the other end, they're too small. Some differentiator along which you can think about that. So where do I want to look for a significant other? Do I want to look on the Santa Monica Pier, which is teeming with people? And if I'm in the middle of the pier and there's a bunch of people around me, metaphorically, who are very similar to me, do I want that? Or do I want to go to this boardwalk and look for a life partner? Well, I want to go to this one, not for the price competition, but because there's more people around who are very similar to me. So what you can think about is the Santa Monica Pier is Match.com, and the smaller pier is Date.com, the one that had many fewer people on it. And it's going to be much harder for me not to find a match, because there's people on it, but to find one who's who's as close to my interests. The more you pack the boardwalk, the more packed our interests are. We're going to have a problem if the boardwalk's too packed. How do we match the right people to the right places? We need a good algorithm for that, but for now, don't worry about that. The left, you can also think of the left one as monster.com for job boards, and you can think of the right one as the Palo Alto classifieds, right? Very, very few jobs out there, not much you can do. Oh, sorry, one other way of thinking about this is the left boardwalk would be the MLS listing service for houses. The right boardwalk would be whatever listings your realtor that you're using happens to have for sale at a given moment. And what do you want to go to? You want to go to the bigger market. That's kind of obvious, I guess. So now what about these niche sites that I talked about? Why doesn't tennisdate.com work? It might. It probably doesn't. And the reason is, what you want to think about is all of those sites, farmersonly.com is the one exception where I've been wrong. Farmersonly.com is extremely successful. I would have bet heavily against them in the initial dates, but I guess that turns out to be a thicker market than I thought. But TennisDate and VeggieDate.com and Farmers Only, they would seem like they would give you the best of both worlds, right? You potentially are limiting yourself to people on the boardwalk who are have those interests. You're cutting off a slice of the boardwalk, which is the right set of people for you. So that would seem like it might work. However, that's only going to work if these sites slice the boardwalk so that they keep all the people around you, rather than just slicing the boardwalk so that the people who are with you are near you on the boardwalk. They have to do a little better job than that. They have to slice the boardwalk so everybody wants to go with you. What do I mean by that? Well, what I mean by that is these niche sites are going to be great if there are a lot of people in that niche, if the niche is a thick market in and of itself. Vegetarians are not a thick enough market, at least in smaller cities, for them to create a thick market where everybody can just limit themselves on that one dimension. Tennis is another thing along those lines. So it has to be the case that this niche is basically a deal breaker. So you want it to be the case, not that there's a lot, not this whole boardwalk thing. The key is, if you're going to have a niche site, it has to be the case that everybody near you on that boardwalk is in that niche. Otherwise, it's not going to work. So tennis is a nice thing, but I don't really care if my partner, it would be great if she played tennis, but it's not a deal breaker for me. And as a result, I'm slicing off a lot of people who would otherwise be near me on the boardwalk if I limited myself to tennisdate.com or veggiedate.com or whatever. So which sites are going to make it? Which niche sites? And we'll come back to this. This all applies to the job market just as well. Which niche sites are going to make it? Well, here's one that I don't have good hopes for. Glutenfreesingles.com. It exists. People are on it. And I'm sure if you're really into gluten-free, maybe this is a good thing. But it just seems to me you're cutting a lot of people who are near you on the boardwalk off if you limit yourself to gluten-free people. Okay? You must love dogs dating. I tried some of these sites because I have a dog. I love my dog, and it's great. And I ended up with a girlfriend who has a dog, and it's all nice because we're both really happy about walking our dogs and things. But I never would have limited myself because a lot of the people who were near me on the boardwalk didn't love dogs, or at least not enough to limit themselves to that site. Okay? So the general principle to take away here is these sites aren't going to make it because they eliminate too many people that are close to you on the boardwalk. There's a lot of people who don't limit themselves to dogs who were near me on the boardwalk, and I didn't want to eliminate them. Now, which niche sites are working? Actually, there's a couple of areas where these sites are working very well. One of them is religious-oriented sites. Christianmingle.com, very successful. Why? Because everybody who you would consider dating if you're a serious Christian is also a serious Christian. It's not like vegans, it's not like gluten-free. This is a group where everyone near you on the boardwalk is in this niche. So we can limit ourselves to that, have our own thick market for just Christians. The LDS dating site is also quite successful. Some of the ones that are focused on certain racial groups that want to stay within themselves, those have been successful. So where there's a big enough site. Another one that's very successful is OurTime.com. If any of you are at like your 40th reunion or later and you're single, this might be a site for you. It's one of the older dating, it's one of the niche sites for older dating, okay? And so these types of sites are going to be more successful than glutenfree.com and so forth because everyone near me on the boardwalk is also potentially interested in this site. So if we're going to break off and have these niche sites, we need to have a thick market in and of itself for that. So now these same exact ideas apply to online job sites. Monster.com is a great place to go looking for people and a great place to go looking for jobs. It's a very thick market and so forth. LinkedIn is another, for certain types of jobs, has become the go-to place because it's so big and so forth. But there are job sites that are specialized that have been very successful as well because everybody in a certain market goes to them. So I interviewed for a different project, I interviewed a company called College Frog in Florida. They have Monster.com, equivalent idea, but it's focused on just people coming out of undergraduate accounting programs. Because these people are coming out and everybody is looking for the same type of job and everybody's looking for the same types of people. And so specializing that site is like focusing on the piece of the boardwalk where all of the job hunters want to be at that point in their life. Later on, the specialized needs vary. So what does this tell us? Well, as a labor economist, thick market, the implications of this are very important. It's quite, now I'm about to quote you research findings from various people. One is, if you go to a metropolitan area that's relatively big, you're going to find, all else equal, that the young people job hop around the job hop more. Why? Because think about the boardwalk as being all the potential jobs for them. If the boardwalk is more filled in, it's worth moving a little further up and down and trial and error until you find exactly the right place for yourself, right? So the bigger markets, but once you're older, what you find is in New York City versus in, what's a smaller city? In New York City versus Portland, you're going to find that people job hop more when they're young, and then they stay in their job longer when they're older. Why? Because once you've found that right place on the boardwalk for yourself, you're that much happier compared to all the other alternatives. Whereas the sparse boardwalk, you keep moving around because you haven't found exactly the right spot. So these things you see in the data. In big metropolitan areas, people job hop more when they're young and less when they're old. By the same token, doctors and lawyers are more specialized in bigger markets. So if you wanted to go, if you lived in Topeka, Kansas, let me try even a smaller city. If you lived in a smaller city in Kansas, I don't know, liberal Kansas, I've been to this place, has about 20,000 people. If you live in liberal Kansas and you get arrested, or you want to get divorced, or you want to buy a house, you would call the same lawyer for all of those things. Because the market is, there's not that many lawyers along the boardwalk, and so they all have to do a bunch of stuff. But if you even go to Topeka, which is bigger but not a big place, for any of those three things, you would call a specialized lawyer. So when we have these markets that are more bigger, specialization spreads out. Or another way of saying that is, here in Palo Alto, our doctors are very specialized, whereas if you go back to liberal Kansas, you're going to find just a few doctors who are very much doing general practice. And if you're really sick, they're going to send you off to a bigger, more specialized market. Outsourcing is easier as well, but I won't get into that as much. So what are some other applications of this idea of thick markets? Thick markets are really an important idea in so many businesses, right? If you're going to start, if you're a member of the class of 2008 or later, you are by definition trying to start some sort of social media company right now. I don't know if you've heard that, that's the new rule here at Stanford. And these are people who have to think constantly about how can we create the thickest possible market. That's what that's all about. So a couple of examples of how that plays out in the business world is, this is the Mall of America in Minnesota. It's the biggest mall in the world. Where would you rather be if you needed a pair of jeans? Walking down some random street in Kansas or in the Mall of America? For some reasons, you might rather be in Kansas because the Mall of America has, probably isn't that fun for some people. But if all you care about is the selection of jeans, you obviously want to be at the Mall of America. So malls and these other places spring up because they want to create thick markets which allow people to get what they want, to match well to their needs. This is the Bowery in Lower Manhattan. I don't know how many of you have ever been down to the Bowery in Lower Manhattan. It was kind of a down and out part of New York for many years. But it had one thing it was very well known for. It had the lighting district. So I don't know if you've ever been to, anybody's been there, but back in the 80s when I lived in New York City, you'd walk down the streets of the Bowery and it was just incredible. There'd be one light store next to the next. There was like blocks of stores that sold lights. Now this was strictly a thick market sort of effect. These stores, think about yourself, you're opening a lighting store and you say, okay, do I want to open it in the lighting district or up on the Upper East Side where there's no other lighting stores around? Well, you're tempted to say I want it on the Upper East Side, and then you don't have as much competition. And you might end up doing that. But on the other hand, you can see saying, hey, wait a minute, I'm going to open in the lighting district because everybody knows when they need lights, they go to the lighting district because that's where the market is thick. And they go from store to store until they find exactly what they need. So as a result, this became a very thick market for lighting. Now, the lighting district is more or less a shell of what it used to be. And what happened is, there was a very thick market. It all worked very nicely. People went there to shop for lights. And then there was a technical change, and nobody needed to go to the lighting district anymore because now you could just sit in your home and do everything on the internet. So the thick market moved from the lighting district into the internet, and we know, so a lot of these physical spaces that were very specialized in creating a thick market have been sort of replaced by the fact that if it can be put on the internet, it saves everybody the trouble of going down to that part of New York. This is a factory making carpeting in Dalton, Georgia. Dalton, Georgia is the carpet capital of the world. Until recently, it made more than 90% of the carpet made in the entire world was made in Dalton, Georgia. Why was that? It was a total historical accident. There was some woman who had a very successful tufted quilt business there back about 100 years ago. I forget the timing of all this now. So you know these quilts that kind of have the threads come up through the bottom and you can make these nice tufted quilts? She had a pretty successful business set up which had grown, and she had a lot of subcontractors that provided the parts. Well, it turned out carpeting is made more or less the way she made her quilts. And so when people started making carpeting, they said, okay, I want to make my carpets. I'm going to go ahead and set this business up in Dalton, Georgia, because look, there's all these people that know how to supply me already. And then everybody who wanted to supply the carpet manufacturers started moving to Dalton. And so these thick markets reinforced themselves where we ended up with everybody down in Dalton, Georgia. Now, foreign competition is finally making Dalton no longer the carpet capital of the world to the degree it once was, but it's still very much the focus of carpet manufacturing. And by the way, the same story explains why cars are made in Detroit. Henry Ford put his business there because people who had made carriages, the subcontractors to carriage makers were in Detroit, and he figured this would be a good way to do it. So again, these thick markets develop for various reasons and in various markets, and you want to be in them. They're a much better place to operate than sort of all by yourself. Okay, so I'm going to just kind of skip through most of stage two. Stage two is presenting yourself. How do you write your resume and that sort of thing. And the main point I'm going to make here, and I'm going to skip the details, are that if you're not very careful, and you have to think about this on your resume and on your dating profile, what you say is very important. What you don't say is equally important. And the economist version of this is a term called statistical discrimination. If I see that you have some characteristic and you are silent about some other characteristic, I might statistically put these two things together. So in the context of online dating, when I was out looking, when I started dating again, I, on my profile, said that I was separated because my divorce wasn't final. Big problem, it turns out. I did not see this coming. I was totally naive about that. I was, I wrote my profile. I'm recently separated. I'm so excited to, and everybody sees this. And of course, there are three types of people who are separated. There are people like myself who are like nice guys ready to give it another try and really ready to jump in and make somebody very happy. There are emotional wrecks who can do nothing but think about their failed relationship. And there are guys who are seeing if there's something better out there and may go back to their wife. It's very hard to tell people I am a type 1. They assume you're not until your divorce is final and then you can move on with your life. Well, by the same token, in the job market, so for me this wasn't a big deal. Like in the world of statistical discrimination, even I have no sympathy for the story I just told you. But there are many cases where this idea is a much bigger problem. For car insurance is one. Hiring young women is probably one that and racial profiling are probably the two biggest examples of the exact same idea I just talked about with much bigger social implications. So if you're hiring for a position of a new Stanford MBA and you have a 27-year-old man and a 27-year-old woman with very similar resumes, you can't help but look ahead and say, okay, wait a minute, statistically, the man is more likely to stay in the workforce than the woman is. That's just a true fact. That's not being prejudiced or anything like that. And so we have laws and so forth to take care of that sort of thing. Racial profiling is the same thing, of course. All this talk of African Americans are much more likely to be pulled over than Caucasians when driving, that's just strictly statistical discrimination. The assumption is that African Americans, whose crime rate is higher, are more likely to commit a crime, and we're going to be more careful about that. Well, this has certain social problems, leads to certain social problems and whatnot, and we've decided to sort of address that through laws and so forth. So the main point of this isn't so much trying to address those social problems, which are beyond the scope of my ability to fix those problems, but to remind you that, in setting up your online profile, be it for jobs or for work or whatever, you have to be very careful what you say because people make assumptions about information that you leave off, and they do it based on statistical relationships between what you have told them and what you leave off. I'm going to skip this. The general idea I'm getting at here is what's known to economists as adverse selection, and it won the Nobel Prize for a guy named George Akerlof, but I'm going to skip that, and I'm even going to skip explaining why you should be scared of Volvo drivers. Anybody wants to talk about Volvo drivers, we can do that afterwards. So what I do want to spend a little bit of time on is step 3, because again, very relevant to the job market as well as the dating market. And let me just give you a quick idea of how people lie on dating sites. So I'm just quoting a couple of studies here. I didn't lie, of course, but I'm told others do. So one academic study found that most men exaggerated their height, most people of both gender understated their weight, and about 1/5 of people lied about their age. And OkCupid, which is a large dating site, started, I might add, by a member of the Stanford GSB class of 2004, their blog, they occasionally will post some information about what's happening on their site, and they found that the average heights claimed by men on their profiles are suspiciously greater than the average height of American men, and that there are an inexplicable number of men who claim to be exactly 6 feet tall. Similarly, they found that the incomes claimed on the site are equally suspicious. There are 4 times as many people making $100,000 per year as there should be. And finally, they found that people often posted dated pictures that likely made them look more attractive than they really were. More specifically, they reached the very scientific finding that, quote, hotter photos were much more likely to be outdated than normal ones. Okay? You can only use the term hotter if you're a professor as long as you're quoting someone else. That's the, So as an economist, I look at that and I say, well, of course people lie. People have incentives to lie. They're maximizing their utility. They're thinking carefully about strategically lying. Lance Armstrong lied for 10 plus years. He tried to mix himself in with the other guys who were racing without taking drugs. Actually, I don't think there were any of those guys, but he was If they existed, he was hoping to be mistaken for one of those people. And so as a result, that's a very rational world we live in. You can be very rational in lying. Now, there's a whole other side of lying which we as economists can't explain. And it's very important in online dating. It goes beyond the purview of economists. And that's people lying to themselves. So you might put on your, so the types of things like height and income, we know that has to, people know their heights and incomes. But on dating profiles, people will say things like, I'm a very positive person. And you meet the person and you say, that's not quite true. And that's not something I as an economist can explain, because that person is likely to be lying to themselves. Okay, and feel free to find the women and ask what I lied about on that dimension when I was on online dating. I'm sure there's a lot of non-economics that played out there as well. So, but the main point is people discount what others say, knowing people are lying. So, and this plays out exactly in the job market. People pad their resumes, and when I look at a resume, I'm skeptical of what I see as a result. And that's very problematic and sad. Why? Because if you want to be a very honest person, you almost can't be. Because everybody else who's competing for that same woman, man, job, whatever it is not everyone, but many people are exaggerating or lying. And you're put in this difficult position. And then as a result, you discount what other people say, despite the fact that some of them are telling the truth. And that's all very unfortunate. So how do we fix these problems? Well, one thing is verification. And in the online dating context, that's problematic, but I think it's moving along more in foreign countries than in the US. So in China and South Korea, there are dating sites where they verify certain information with government documents. So you send in your driver's license, which tells them your height and your weight and things like that. Or you send in your, I don't know, something, your weight, your paycheck to verify your income and things like that. So that's good, but as business people, you might already be thinking ahead and realize that changes the nature of your dating site's business model from a very fixed cost thing where you just set up the site and the users take care of everything themselves, to a much more variable cost thing where I now have to have somebody verify your height and weight and do all these things that are time consuming and expensive. So if we haven't seen anybody crack that nut, so to speak, here in the US yet. In a few foreign countries where labor costs are cheaper, they've been able to go a little more in that direction. There is, however, some hope as long as you're a woman. In the US, there's a site called onlulu.com where you can go and review men. It's just like Amazon reviews, only very different, I guess. I don't know. I've never seen any of these reviews because the site, you're not allowed, you have to log in through Facebook, and so it knows your gender, and you can't go on if you're male. So that's one avenue to go through. But the second one, where I want to spend more time, partially because it's so interesting from an economics point of view and partially because of the GSB relationship here, is the economic concept of signaling. And this is what won our former dean, Michael Spence, the Nobel Prize in Economics. And the idea is very simple. It's just you need to, when you can't verify, if you can't walk around with a sign that says, I really do make this much money and it somehow could be verified, in the absence of being able to do that, you want to think of other ways to separate yourself from the liars, from the fakers. Not necessarily, liars, fakers, whatever you want to call it. In order for a signal to work, it has to have two qualities. It has to be the case that it's correlated with whether or not you're really the type of person who's qualified for something. And I'll show you that in an example in a second. And it has to be costly for you to signal. And it has to be specifically less costly for the qualified people than for the unqualified people. Otherwise, the system breaks down, and the Lance Armstrongs can mix with everyone else, or the lying, cheating guys on websites can mix with everybody else. So the way Spence set this up, forget about now back to the job market for a minute, the way Spence wrote this model some 40 years ago now was he started from the following assumption, which is a little bit troubling given he used to be the dean here at the business school. He started from the assumption that school was a total waste of time. You learn nothing in school. I was kind of hoping for a few, that sounds ridiculous. But having gone here, I'm getting more agreement. I see I'm getting more agreement from you than I was hoping for. So the good students, the assumption here is that the good students are qualified for good jobs, and people who would be bad students would not be good in those good jobs. And so we make people go to school not because we want to separate, not because they learn anything, but because it helps us separate the good people from the, let me rephrase that. It separates the more able workers from the less able workers. And so as a result, if the equilibrium works out nicely, people who know they're not able don't even bother going to school because it's not worth the cost to them, and we get this nice separation. Well, how does that work in other contexts? Well, let's talk about it in dating for a second. There are two problems in dating, two different kinds of problems. One is if I go to a dating site, I can send a message at very low cost to a woman and say, I want to meet you. Your profile looks great. So how do we get around that? How do we make it a little more costly for you and make it a little more meaningful when you say, I want to meet you, rather than sending 100 similar messages? Well, one is the way I solved this problem was I would send fewer messages but personalize them more. So I would make sure I looked in the profile and I'd say, I like that same show on NPR. I like the picture of your dog and so forth, things like that. And that allows people, if you get a message like that relative to one that says, hey, let's meet for coffee, hopefully that has some of an impression. Well, it turns out there's a Korean dating site that took this a step further and helped people separate themselves from those who were just average guys out for, to meet anybody they could meet. They proposed a system of virtual roses. And the way this system worked is they said, during a period of time, anybody on the site can send as many I want to meet you or other messages as they wanted, but in addition, over a period of time, they were allowed exactly two virtual roses. And these were basically saying, I really want to meet you, okay? You're one of the two people I most want to meet. Now remember the two properties of a signal. It's costly, because in this case you only have two of them, so the opportunity cost of using your signal was very high. And the second thing is it separates you from those who don't, it's correlated with whether or not you really want to meet that person, because of course you're going to use your rose on the people. And as a result, this particular thing helped make better matches in the Korean market in which it was used. Now, there are problems. This hasn't rolled out more generally because there are ways of gaming that system once it becomes part of the thing. You can have multiple profiles. You can do other sorts of things that would ruin it. But at least if you can figure out a way to get the signaling thing down, it seems like it can help make better matches. Example number two is if I want to say I make a lot of money, so I'm sorry, crass fact. The data back me up on this. I'm not statistically discriminating. I'm just telling you the data are true on this. Men are attracted to good-looking women. Women are attracted to men who make money. Sad, but true. So how do I say I make a lot of money when anybody can say that? How do I make it true? So it's only self-reported and so forth. So, you can think about sort of ways of wasting a lot of money to sort of show somebody I care about, I really have a lot of money. One option I've always thought about, and no dating site has taken me up on this, is charge people X dollars, maybe $1 or $5 to send a message saying, I want to meet you, and in the process choose a charity that money goes to. And that not only signals I really want to meet you because I had to spend that money, but it also shows you which charity I'm interested in. So if I get a message from a woman that says, who had to pay $5 and she chose to send her money to Planned Parenthood, and I get another one from someone who sent their money to the NRA, we've made some money for some organizations, and we've also learned a lot about people along the way. Another solution We like as economists to think of very rational people as being very rational. But one of the all-time great irrational but rational economic moments was from the movie The Dark Knight, where the Joker, played by Heath Ledger, signaled to the mob, I am in this for things other than the money, by burning a big pile of the money that they had made and stolen. So, you know, an alternative, if it weren't for the fact that you'd look like a crazy person, would be to, on the first date, put down $1,000 and light it on fire. And that would, in fact, show people that you were very wealthy. Nobody's taken me up on that one either. And I think that's just as well, both for secondhand smoke reasons and other issues that would come up. There are many other applications of signaling. I'm going to skip ahead to the very last point real quickly, so I leave a little time for some discussion. My favorite is maybe college applications. Early decisions are just a form of signaling. You have one signal. It's expensive because you only get to apply early to one place. Okay, and so that's what early admissions is basically all about. And there's a nice paper by a couple of economists, one of whom is John Levin in the economics department here, showing the importance of early decisions as a means of signaling and how schools take it very seriously. Okay, so those are a few other examples that I'm going to not talk about right now, because I want to, if I haven't completely offended you with taking an economics take on looking for a life partner, I want to make sure I get all the way to the end on that. And this is the part of the book. It's chapter 1. It's about search theory, but the reason it's the last part of this talk is it's about settling down. It's picking the person you want to settle down with. Now, I have a girlfriend who I've now been seeing for 2.5 years, and I can never let her go because she's seen me talk about this and read chapter 1 of the book, and she finds it acceptable. And I think that the number of people for whom that's true is a very limited set. So the one, you know, I'm looking for the one. That is just, that person doesn't exist. I hate to be the one to break it to you. The perfect person doesn't exist, okay? So what you really do, remember I said economics is the study of scarce resources. So search theory, when thinking about searching for a partner, the scarce resource is your time. You go on a dating site or you go to parties, you're using up your time. This is very costly. It's time not spent doing chores. It's time not spent writing articles for economics journals. It's time not spent playing tennis. It's time not spent watching Downton Abbey, if anybody else is a fan of Downton Abbey, right? So on the one hand, you think, oh, I'm going to just keep searching for a partner all the time because that's the most important thing in my life. Well, of course, it might be the most important, but on the margin, you substitute away from that towards other things as well. So people keep searching, not until they find the one, but until they find somebody who is good enough. God, that sounds terrible, I know. She reminds me all the time that I've said this. She did the same thing, right? I understand that. So we settle. There's a really nice book on this by a woman, a psychologist named Lori Gottlieb, who basically takes the view that women are not good at this. Relatively high-income, educated American women are not good at this. They don't settle well enough. And so her book is called something like Marry Him, the Case for Settling for Mr. Good Enough, or something like that. So it's not just an economics concept, but the underlying idea is very economics in terms of thinking about you keep searching until the costs outweigh the benefits, and then you say, okay, I'm going to stop there. Now, that's all well and good. Now, of course, this is the case. I've introduced this in the most non-romantic way possible in the market for partners, but this is exactly the case where the job market applies so perfectly. Because what do you do when you search for a job? You don't search for a job till you find the perfect job. You keep searching until it's no longer worth the trouble to keep trying to do better, to try to trade up in the job market. Same with employees. You keep interviewing people until you find somebody where you know they're not literally the perfect person for the job, but at some point you say, okay, the costs of doing better would be outweighed. So settling is the best strategy in both of these contexts. Now, this idea of settling, if you will, was very important. In 2010, it won Dale Mortensen and Chris Pissarides the Nobel Prize in Economics. And one of the key points of what they pointed out is that search theory, search frictions, that is the time spent searching, leads to unemployment. If we're constantly looking for the one, we spend more, there's time spent where, you know, where we are unemployed. Or as the Nobel Committee said, since the search process requires time and resources, it creates frictions in the market. That's the time and resources spent looking for jobs. On such search markets, the demands of some buyers will not be met, while some sellers cannot sell as much as they would wish. Simultaneously, there are both job vacancies and unemployment on the labor market. And the exact same logic applies to finding a life partner. And so as I like to say, you want to be very careful not to be too picky while on the partner market, if you will, because you end up with the equivalent of unemployment, which is loneliness, or as I like to say, romantic unemployment. So that's basically, you know, you got to at some point say, good, you know, enough is enough and move on with your life. Okay, now there are many other places we could talk about search costs. I won't get into these now because I've already gone over the time I wanted to use on this. I will just tell you, if I've interested anybody in following up on this, you'll learn other exciting facts in my book, such as that dating sites are driven by network effects, which we already talked about a little bit, but I draw out in a lot more detail. Another sad fact of life is we are drawn to people who are like ourselves. Okay, and this has, the reason it's a sad fact of life is it inhibits economic mobility quite a bit, right? So if you think of somebody marrying somebody from a completely different socioeconomic class, that moves people around and mixes them better. That doesn't happen that well in real life, and the economics of that are something that's very interesting to me and many others. The other thing is the final point I'll make is that families have economics too, and you know, as I like to say, dating is really just a precursor to grand bargains and negotiations over who's going to take out the garbage. So that's the main point I'm going to leave you with. Thank you. I'm going to, you know, I would love to hear any questions anybody has. If you have any more interest in following up, I have a Twitter account that at least 7 people are on, and I'd be delighted to have you be the 8th. So thanks very much.
What's your thought on this idea in big markets? In the interviewing, I'm continually getting advice when I talk with people to tell them, here's target companies I'm looking at, but I'm looking for the big market, which is, here's what I'm looking at, what thoughts do you have, so that they'll have a lot of ideas to talk about, versus if I give them target markets, I'm giving them, you know, small ideas.
Yeah, and I think, so one thing I left out of the whole thick market and the search theory thing is, beyond that, the stuff the operations research guys and others are good at is figuring out how you make these matches. And so the job board of tomorrow is not going to be the biggest, even though I told you big is better. And the dating site of tomorrow that's going to be successful is not the one that's the biggest now, although they have a head start. It's the ones that figure out how to get you those people closest to you on the boardwalk in either market. So these algorithms that guys are working on all the time in both dating sites and job markets and so forth, the people who figure out how to write those algorithms to match people effectively, those people will, A, make a lot of money, and B, do the world a lot of good. And as economists, we love people who do both of those things at the same time, right? And so that would be great. So in terms of thinking about what do you tell people in terms of what markets to go after and how to target, that's an interesting question. I think I'd have to think through the details in a particular context, but right now, in this day and age in the job market, for better or worse, you want to think about using phrases that don't get automatically spit out of these a lot of firms are now reviewing resumes automatically. You have to be very careful with some of the stuff I briefly talked about in statistical discrimination. If you have any words on there that kick you out, that's a big problem. So that's one thing, but that's not a very specific idea. So I don't know, I didn't answer your question very well.
I guess the question I was having.
Wait, you have to wait for a microphone if that's okay.
Yeah, the question I had is everything you were talking about was very much online, and I guess my question is when you talk with people, they're always asking what targeted companies, and by definition you're limiting the conversation, and everything you're talking about is allow for thick market conversation.
Right. Okay, very good point. Sorry. So the thing you really want to do, the two ideals that go against one another is find the big, thick market with a lot of companies, and then, if it's worth the trouble to you to find just the right job, do a lot of research, and then target, signal, whatever term you want to use, the few that you think are exactly the right match for you. And I think, you know, job market strategy, would I rather send 100 resumes generically or 10 very targeted with a long cover letter about why I'm a really good match to that place? I hope the second strategy would work better. We'll see, you know, in the long term how that does and doesn't work, and whether the algorithms can help make that happen more.
I just wanted to ask, there's an economic concept that we've seen firsthand on online dating, which is product differentiation, that you haven't really talked about. Our daughter languished on Match until she updated her profile to say that she had spent her summers working on a lock psych ward, managing a high-end lingerie company in London, that she'd broken my nose, and she'd been polygraphed by a federal government agency, all of which were true. After that, she could not fight off the number of people. She had to keep big lists of the guys who wanted to meet her.
That's a very eclectic and interesting set of things your daughter has done. I'm guessing the lingerie one was the only one she actually needed to put on her website to up the attention she was getting. I don't remember hearing a lot of talk in the men's locker room about, God, I really want to meet a woman who worked on the lockdown ward of a psych hospital, but you never know. But anyway, the simple answer to your question is, I'm an economist. We have marketing guys who are much better than I am at sort of saying, how do you take, so I said, here are the only idea I gave you for setting up your profile is be careful what you don't say, but also be really careful what you do say, obviously. So you need, you know, your daughter did exactly the right thing, I might add, in that when setting up a dating profile or a resume, this is very obvious. Have people look at it. Have people look at it and say, that's kind of boring. I happen to know you did these other interesting things. You should add that. Now, going back to my economist view, have them look at it and say, what are you thinking is true about me that I haven't said here? So, for example, I was on a radio show, the Freakonomics podcast, and we went through, this sounds really cheesy, but it wasn't that bad. We went through this guy's profile, and I gave him advice on how to do his profile, and he kept talking about how much fun he was and how much he liked to party, but he was getting to a certain age where women were looking to settle down, and of course that was the assumption, the underlying assumption that people would make there is you're not ready to settle down. That type of thing, which, you know, seems obvious, but when you're not objective about it, you forget about. So advice number one from both the marketing side and the economist side is have someone else help you with both your resume and your online dating profile. That's the last question? Okay, well, thank you so much again. I really appreciate it.